The tavern was filled with noise, the clatter of cups, the murmur of voices, the smell of hot food, and the smoke of strange alien spices. In one corner, an old alien walked in slowly, his back bent, his skin pale and tired. His clothes were torn at the edges, and his steps were shaky like he had walked too far without rest. He looked around with weak eyes, searching for a place to sit. Some creatures laughed when they saw him, whispering insults about how useless he looked, how poor he seemed. Still, he moved forward, his hands trembling as he reached the counter. He asked softly for a bowl of warm broth, just one small meal. The tavern keeper narrowed his eyes, asking for payment before serving. The old alien searched through his worn bag, pulling out a few tiny coins that were not enough. The room grew quiet in that moment, and then the guards who stood near the door laughed loudly. They were big, armored, and cruel, proud of their position. One of them stepped closer, kicking the old alien's bag from his hand. The coins rolled across the floor, and the laughter grew louder. The old alien tried to pick them up, but another guard shoved him down, his frail body hitting the wooden boards with a painful sound. The guards told the tavern keeper not to waste food on someone like him. They called the old alien worthless, a beggar who should be thrown out into the cold street. Some people in the tavern looked away, pretending not to notice. Others just shook their heads. No one stood up to defend him. The old alien's lips trembled as he whispered that he was hungry, that he had nowhere else to go. His hands shook as he held on to the counter, trying to stand again. The guards surrounded him, their heavy boots echoing as they moved closer. They reached for him, ready to drag him out of the tavern like trash. The old alien closed his eyes, his body weak, his voice breaking as he begged them to let him stay just for one warm meal. His words were drowned out by the laughter of the guards. They enjoyed his suffering, treating it as sport. In the far corner of the tavern, a human traveler had been sitting quietly. He had listened to the voices, had seen the way the old alien was treated, and his jaw had tightened with anger. He placed his cup on the table, stood up, and walked slowly toward the counter. The sound of his boots made some of the crowd look up in surprise. Humans were rare in this city, and most who came here avoided any trouble. Yet this one walked straight into it. The guards turned to him with mocking smiles. They asked if he wanted to be thrown out as well, but the human did not answer them. His eyes were fixed on the old alien. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a handful of credits, and placed them firmly on the counter. The coins clinked, heavy and real. The tavern grew silent. Even the tavern keeper froze, his hand hovering above the counter. The human's voice was steady when he spoke. He said he would pay for the old alien's meal. He said the old one would eat tonight. His tone was calm, but his words cut through the laughter like a blade. For the first time, the old alien raised his head, his eyes wide, his lips trembling with disbelief. A stranger, a human, was defending him. He whispered thank you, his voice so faint it was almost lost in the silence. The guards stepped closer, glaring at the human. They told him this was not his business, that he had no right to interfere in alien matters. One of them shoved him lightly on the shoulder, testing his reaction. But the human did not move. His feet stayed firm on the ground. His stare was hard, sharp, unyielding. He told them again, in a low and steady voice, that the old alien would eat. His words carried no fear, only certainty. The room was tense now, every alien inside watching. Some leaned forward, whispering to each other. None could believe what they were seeing. A human was defying the guards. No one had ever dared to do that before. The guards laughed again, but it was weaker this time, forced. They warned the human that he would regret this. They pushed past him, but the weight of his gaze followed them. Slowly, unwillingly, they stepped back, muttering threats under their breath. The tavern keeper, still shaken, finally served a hot bowl of broth and bread. The human placed the food in front of the old alien, guiding his trembling hands to the bowl. The old alien began to eat slowly, his eyes glistening as he tasted the warmth of food for the first time in days. He looked at the human again, whispering gratitude between weak breaths. His voice broke, his hands shaking as he held the bread. For him, this moment was more than a meal, it was dignity returned. Around them, the tavern slowly filled with whispers again. Some stared at the human with wonder, others with fear. A few even lowered their eyes in shame, realizing they had done nothing while cruelty unfolded before them. But no one spoke against him. The silence was heavy, filled with a mix of awe and uncertainty. The human sat down beside the old alien, ignoring the stares, ignoring the muttering of the guards as they finally left. He stayed calm, watching as the old one ate. For the first time that night, the tavern's noise felt different. Beneath the surface, something had shifted, something small but powerful. The sight of a human standing up for someone who had nothing sparked a quiet fire in the hearts of those who witnessed it. And in that moment, the old alien's weak eyes shone not with fear or pain, but with hope. The guards stood frozen for a moment, their eyes on the human who had dared to put money on the counter. Then one of them laughed, a low, mocking sound that spread quickly to the others. They called the human foolish, a wanderer who had no idea how things worked here. They told him he was wasting his credits on someone who was already as good as dead. The old alien kept his head bowed, ashamed, while the human did not move his eyes from the guards. He spoke again, his tone calm but firm, saying the old alien would eat tonight, and there was nothing more to discuss. The largest guard stepped forward, his heavy boots shaking the floorboards. He leaned close to the human, his breath carrying the sour scent of strong drink. He shoved the human's shoulder roughly, expecting him to stumble. But the human stood steady, his body unmoving like stone. His gaze never broke. The guard growled, asking if he thought himself a hero. The human answered simply that he thought it was wrong to let someone starve when he could help. His words were plain, but they carried a strength that made the room fall silent. The old alien lifted his head slightly, eyes wide with surprise. His lips trembled and his voice cracked as he whispered gratitude again. It was the first time in many years that anyone had spoken for him. The guards sneered at the sound, mocking him further, calling him a parasite clinging to the mercy of strangers. They asked the human why he bothered, why waste his money and risk his life for someone who was nothing. The human replied with only one sentence, because no one else would. The words were simple, but the effect was heavy. The tavern's crowd shifted uneasily in their seats. Some lowered their eyes, ashamed, while others leaned forward, curious to see what would happen next. The guards did not like the silence, nor the way the human's voice carried across the room. Their pride burned at being challenged in front of so many. The biggest guard's hand shot out, gripping the human's collar. But before he could pull him closer, the human raised his own hand and pushed the arm away with controlled force. The guard's body jerked back a step, his balance broken. Shock filled the room. Nobody touched the guards. Nobody dared. Yet the human had done it without hesitation, without fear. His eyes were steady, calm, almost cold, and it made the guards hesitate in a way insults never could. The tavern keeper, sweating behind the counter, urged everyone to calm down. He tried to laugh nervously, saying the bill had already been paid and there was no need for trouble. But his voice shook and his eyes darted nervously toward the door, afraid the fight would grow worse. The guards, however, were not ready to back down. They leaned in closer, whispering threats to the human. They promised that this city had no place for outsiders who meddled in local order. They told him to leave the old alien behind or face punishment later. The human did not answer them right away. Instead, he picked up the bowl of broth the tavern keeper had placed on the counter and carefully set it in front of the old alien. His hand was steady, his movements calm, but his silence was louder than any word. The old alien's eyes filled with tears as he reached for the food, his frail fingers shaking as they touched the warm bowl. He looked at the human again, his voice breaking as he tried to say thank you, but the words stuck in his throat. The human only nodded in return. The guards, frustrated by the quiet defiance, finally stepped back. They muttered that this was not over, that the human would learn what it meant to cross them. Their boots slammed against the floor as they left the tavern, the door creaking wide and then shutting hard behind them. The tension inside the room eased slightly, but whispers quickly filled the air. The story was already spreading. An outsider, a human, had stood against the guards. The human returned to his seat at the table, sitting beside the old alien who ate slowly, tears falling silently down his wrinkled cheeks. Every bite was heavy with memory, with relief, with something close to dignity. The old alien leaned close, whispering that he had once been a respected elder of his clan, but when he grew old and weak, they cast him aside. He said he had walked from place to place, begging for food, and all he had found was cruelty. His words were soft, but the human listened carefully, his jaw tight, his hand curled into a fist against the table. Around them, some aliens in the tavern stared openly at the scene. Others looked away, unwilling to meet the human's eyes. A group of merchants whispered together, their voices low, wondering if this man was reckless or brave. One of them muttered that the guards would surely come after him again. Another said the guards would not forget being shamed in front of so many. But the human did not care for their whispers. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the room with calm certainty. He knew he had made enemies tonight. He knew the guards would return. Yet in his heart, he also knew he would not have acted any differently. The old alien beside him, eating with trembling hands, was proof enough that the choice had been right. The tavern slowly returned to life, the noise of cups and voices growing again. But under the surface, a new energy had settled in the room. Everyone had seen what happened, and the image of a human standing firm against the guards would not fade easily. Some would tell the story in whispers, others in proud voices, but all would remember the moment. The old alien finished his meal slowly, then leaned back in his chair, closing his tired eyes for a moment, as if the food had given him more than strength. It had given him peace. He turned to the human and asked softly why he risked himself for someone like him. The human gave the same answer as before, his voice steady, his eyes unwavering. Because no one else would. The words lingered in the air, simple yet powerful, and for the first time in years, the old alien felt a spark of hope that he was not alone in the universe. The old alien sat with hunched shoulders, his frail hands shaking slightly as he lifted the spoon to his lips. The steam from the bowl rose gently, and every sip seemed to bring life back into his tired body. He chewed the bread slowly, like each bite was something sacred, something he had been denied for far too long. The human sat beside him, silent, watching without judgment. Around them, the tavern murmured with whispers, but no one dared approach the table. The guards' shadow still lingered, but their absence was louder than their presence. The old alien lowered the spoon for a moment, his watery eyes staring into the bowl. His lips quivered, and his voice finally broke the silence. He told the human that once, long ago, he had not been like this. He said he had been an elder of his clan, a teacher, a leader whose words were valued. But time had made him weak, and weakness had no place in his world. His own kin had cast him out, saying he was too old to work, too frail to fight, too useless to keep alive. His words carried no bitterness, only exhaustion. The human listened carefully, his face calm, though inside his chest a heavy anger stirred. He clenched his fists under the table, hearing how a life of service had ended in rejection. The old alien's voice cracked when he said that he had begged in many places, hoping someone would help, but all he found were cold stares and cruel words. In this city, the old alien whispered, those who cannot pay are less than nothing. His eyes lowered to the bowl again, as if ashamed to even exist. The human leaned forward, his voice steady as he asked the old alien his name. For a moment, the elder was silent, surprised that someone cared to ask. Then, in a trembling voice, he gave his name, one that had once carried weight, but now sounded forgotten. The human repeated it softly, like it mattered, like he would remember it. The old alien's lips trembled, and for the first time in many years, he felt like he was more than a shadow. As he ate, his story unfolded further. He explained how his people believed the weak must be abandoned for the strong to survive. It was their tradition, a cruel law followed without question. Even the tavern where they sat now was part of that belief. No meal for those who could not pay, no kindness for those without power. The human's jaw tightened as he heard this. To him, strength meant protecting those who could not protect themselves, not casting them away. He shook his head slowly, muttering that such a law was not strength but cowardice. The old alien stared at him with wide, uncertain eyes. No one had ever called it cowardice before. To his people, it was order, survival, balance. Yet the human's words rang with a truth he could not ignore. He whispered that maybe the human was right. Maybe all his life he had believed in something cruel disguised as wisdom. His voice cracked with doubt, but there was also a spark of something new in it. Hope, small and fragile. The tavern around them seemed to shift in mood. A few aliens at nearby tables leaned closer, pretending not to listen, while their ears caught every word. The story of the elders' fall and the humans' defiance against the guards was spreading like fire. Some were curious, some uneasy, others quietly impressed. But no one spoke. They only watched. The old alien took another sip of broth, his hands still shaking, and then looked at the human with eyes filled with questions. Why had he helped? Why risk angering the guards for a stranger? The human's answer was as calm and plain as before. Because no one else would. The old alien's lips pressed together, and tears welled in his eyes again. Those words were not just kindness. They were a reminder that dignity could still exist, even here. The silence between them was heavy but not empty. It was the silence of understanding, of two lives that had crossed for a reason. The old alien ate slowly, every mouthful easing the pain of his hunger, but also every mouthful feeding the broken spirit inside him. He whispered that the human's act would not be forgotten, that even if he died tomorrow, this night would stay with him until the end. The human only nodded, his eyes steady, as if to say the act required no thanks. At another table, a merchant whispered to his companion that the human was reckless. Another answered that maybe he was brave. The tavern keeper shook his head behind the counter, wiping his hands nervously, already fearing the guard's return. But the human ignored them all. His attention never left the old alien, who sat straighter now, as if the weight of shame had lifted slightly. The old alien began to speak of the past again, telling stories of his clan, of younger days when he had guided others, when his words had carried meaning. His voice grew stronger with each memory, his eyes brighter. For a moment, the tavern was filled not with whispers of fear, but with the soft sound of an elder remembering his worth. The human listened patiently, never interrupting, letting the old alien's dignity return piece by piece. As the night deepened, the old alien finished his meal and set the empty bowl down with trembling hands. He looked at the human and whispered that tonight he had not just eaten food, he had tasted respect again. His voice cracked, his throat dry, but the meaning was clear. The human leaned forward, his tone firm yet gentle, telling him that no one deserved to be thrown away, no matter their age, no matter their strength. The old alien closed his eyes for a moment, and a faint smile touched his lips, the first he had shown in many years. The tavern's noise slowly returned to normal, yet a shift had taken place. Every witness knew they had seen something rare, something that would echo through the city by dawn. And as the old alien sat beside the human, his frail body warmed by food and his heart lifted by kindness, he knew that for the first time in a long time, he was not invisible. He was not worthless. He was alive, and someone had cared enough to see him. The streets outside the tavern were narrow and dimly lit, filled with the smoke of machines and the smell of oil from the workshops nearby. The human walked alone, his coat pulled tightly around him, as he made his way toward the small inn where he had rented a room. The night air was cold, the wind sharp, and most of the shops had already closed their doors. Only the glow of lanterns and the occasional sound of footsteps echoed in the silence. Yet the human's instincts told him he was not alone. Every shadow felt heavier, every sound sharper, as if unseen eyes followed his every step. He turned down an alley, the stone walls tall and uneven, dripping with moisture. The sound of footsteps grew clearer behind him. He stopped, listening. For a moment there was silence. Then, out of the darkness, figures emerged. The same guards from the tavern stepped into the pale light, their armored boots striking the ground in rhythm. They carried batons and blades, their faces twisted with pride and anger. They blocked both ends of the alley, surrounding him like hunters cornering prey. The biggest guard, the one who had shoved him earlier, stepped forward. His voice was low but filled with venom as he told the human he had made a mistake. No outsider was allowed to shame them in front of others, and no human would leave this city unpunished for interfering. The human did not back away. His eyes scanned the group calmly, counting their number, measuring the distance. His jaw tightened, but his voice stayed steady as he told them that what they had done to the old alien was cruel and that cruelty was not strength. His words made the guards sneer. their laughter bouncing off the walls. One of them swung his baton at him without warning. The human moved quickly, raising his arm to block the strike. The blow stung, but his feet stayed firm on the ground. He struck back with his fist, the sound of bone against armor ringing in the alley. The guard staggered back, clutching his side. The others rushed in with shouts, their weapons raised. The alley erupted in chaos. The human fought with a strength they had not expected. His movements were sharp, efficient, learned from battles far harsher than this. He ducked under a swing, driving his shoulder into one guard's chest, sending him crashing against the wall. Another tried to stab with a blade, but the human twisted, grabbing the wrist and forcing the weapon down into the ground before kicking the guard's leg out from under him. Their cries of pain filled the narrow passage. But the guards were many, and their blows came fast. The human took strikes across his back, the metal of their weapons leaving burning pain in his skin. He gritted his teeth, refusing to fall. He grabbed one guard's arm, twisting until a sickening crack filled the air, and the guard dropped his weapon with a scream. Another swung hard, the baton slamming into the human's ribs, forcing him to stumble for the first time. His breath came heavy, his body aching, but his eyes still burned with determination. The leader of the guards growled in anger, rushing forward with his blade. He aimed straight for the human's chest, but the human sidestepped at the last second, grabbing the leader's arm and pulling him forward. Using the man's own momentum, he slammed him face first into the wall. The impact echoed through the alley, the leader groaning as blood spilled from his nose. The human stood over him, breathing hard, battered but unbroken. The remaining guards hesitated. They had thought this fight would be easy, that one human would fall quickly under their numbers. Instead, they had been beaten back, bruised, broken, humiliated in their own territory. Their pride burned hotter than their wounds, but their fear now outweighed it. They muttered curses, dragging their injured comrades away, spitting threats that this was not the end. They promised the human that more would come, that he had made powerful enemies. Their voices faded as they disappeared into the night, their boots echoing farther and farther away. The human leaned against the wall for a moment, his chest rising and falling heavily. Pain spread through his ribs, his arms, his back, but his spirit was steady. He straightened himself and walked slowly back toward his inn, his steps firm despite the bruises. The night was quiet again, though the tension still clung to the air. He knew this was only the beginning. The guards would not forgive what he had done, and they would not stop until they tried again to crush him. Inside his small room, the human sat on the edge of the bed, removing his coat and shirt. The mirror across from him showed the bruises forming, dark red and purple spreading across his skin. He touched them lightly, wincing but not complaining. He poured water into a bowl, washing away the blood from his knuckles, his movements slow but steady. The memory of the fight replayed in his mind, but so did the memory of the old alien's eyes, full of gratitude and disbelief. That memory burned stronger than the pain in his body. He leaned back against the wall, closing his eyes for a brief moment. He knew they would return, and he knew next time they might bring more than batons and blades. But he also knew he would not walk away. What he had done was not for glory or for pride. It was because no one else had dared. If he backed down now, then everything he had stood for in that tavern would mean nothing. His jaw tightened again, his spirit refusing to bend. Somewhere outside, the city continued its restless hum. But within that quiet room, a human sat bruised yet unbroken, aware that his choice had set something in motion he could no longer stop. And though the shadows of threat grew larger around him, the fire in his chest burned brighter, ready for whatever would come next. The next day came slowly, the light of morning cutting through the smoke-filled skies of the city. The human rose from his bed, his body aching from the fight in the alley. Bruises covered his ribs, his back, and his arms. But his spirit felt stronger, not weaker. He washed his face with cold water, tightened the straps of his coat, and walked back toward the tavern. The streets were already awake, with merchants calling out prices, machines roaring, and beggars huddling in the corners. Yet wherever he walked, he felt eyes on him. Some looked with curiosity, some with respect, and some with quiet fear. The story of last night had already spread. Everyone knew the human had stood against the guards. When he stepped inside the tavern, the noise hushed for a moment. Dozens of eyes turned toward him, studying the bruises on his face, the steady way he walked despite them. Whispers spread through the room like wind in dry grass. Some leaned closer to hear more. Others tried to pretend they were not staring. But all of them were watching. The old alien sat in the same corner as before, his frail body wrapped in a worn cloak. When he saw the human, his eyes lit with something close to joy. He struggled to his feet, his weak hands gripping the table for support. His lips trembled as he greeted the human with a word that made many in the room shift uneasily. Protector. The human placed a hand on the old alien's shoulder and guided him back to the chair. He ordered food for the both of them, laying down credits without hesitation. The tavern keeper served quickly, his hands shaking slightly, afraid of what more trouble this act of kindness might bring. Yet when the plates arrived, the human and the old alien ate together, as if nothing else in the room mattered. Slowly, other poor aliens began to gather nearby. They did not sit at the same table, but they came close, their eyes watching the human with a mixture of awe and hunger. Some were crippled, some were young or sick, and others were simply cast aside like the elder had been. They whispered to each other, saying that maybe the human would help them too. Maybe kindness was not yet dead in this city. The tavern keeper leaned in, his voice low, warning the human that the guards would return. He said they would not forget the humiliation, and that this time they would not come quietly. He urged the human to leave the city before it was too late. But the human shook his head, his eyes steady. He said he would not leave while injustice ruled here, and he would not walk away from the people who had no one else to defend them. His words carried across the room, and even though he spoke softly, every ear heard them. The old alien's hands trembled again, but not from weakness this time. He reached out and touched the human's arm, whispering that no one had spoken like this in years. He told him that many in the city were broken not by hunger alone, but by hopelessness. They had accepted cruelty as law, believing there was no other way. But the human's defiance had shaken that belief. His act had been small, but it had shown that the guards were not untouchable. His voice cracked as he said that maybe things could change. The human listened silently, but his eyes softened. He looked around at the poor aliens watching him, their thin faces filled with quiet hope. He felt the weight of their stares, the unspoken request in their eyes. They wanted more than food. They wanted someone to prove that they were not invisible, that they mattered. He leaned forward, telling the elder that strength was not measured by how the powerful treated the weak, but by how the strong protected those who could not protect themselves. His words sank deep, leaving many in the tavern speechless. The door to the tavern opened, and for a moment, fear flashed in every eye. But it was not the guards. It was a small family of beggars, covered in dust, their clothes little more than rags. The tavern keeper began to wave them away, saying they had no money. But before he could finish, the human called out. He placed credits on the counter and told the keeper to serve them. The room froze again. The beggar family stared at the human, unsure if they should believe. But when the food was placed before them, they fell to their knees in thanks. The whispers in the tavern grew louder now, but they were different from before. They carried excitement, not just fear. The old alien leaned close to the human, whispering that what he was doing was dangerous. He reminded him that the guards would not just target him anymore. They would punish anyone who followed him, anyone who dared to take hope from his actions. The human nodded slowly, his expression hardening. He knew the risk, but he also knew that silence was worse than danger. Cruelty survived only because no one dared to stand against it. He would rather bleed than watch others starve. The merchants in the corner muttered nervously, saying the human was starting something he could not finish. But another voice rose from a poor worker in the back. He said loudly that the human had done more in 2 nights than the whole city had done in years. Others nodded, murmuring in agreement. The mood of the tavern was shifting, like a tide turning after years of stillness. The human sat calmly through it all, eating beside the old alien, showing no fear of the whispers, no fear of the eyes on him. More and more poor aliens began to sit closer, as if his presence alone gave them courage. The tavern, once a place of silence and shame, had begun to change into something else. It was no longer only a place of hunger, it was becoming a place of quiet rebellion. The day stretched on, and when the human finally stood to leave, the old alien rose with him. His weak body leaned on the human's arm, but his eyes carried strength again, the strength of someone who believed in something greater than fear. As they walked toward the door, the entire tavern watched in silence, the weight of the moment heavy in every chest. They all knew the guards would return, but they also knew something new had been born. The seed of resistance had been planted, and it had begun with one human who refused to look away. The tavern was busy that night, the air thick with smoke and the smell of roasted meat. But the mood was different from before. Whispers filled the room, and all eyes kept drifting toward the corner table where the human sat with the old alien beside him. More poor aliens had gathered near them, their tired faces glowing faintly with hope. Some of them dared to smile for the first time in many days, whispering that maybe change was possible. But the tavern keeper's nervous eyes darted again and again toward the door, as if waiting for a storm. And the storm soon arrived. The door burst open with a heavy crash. This time it was not just a few guards. Armored reinforcements poured inside, their boots pounding the wooden floor, their armor gleaming under the light. There were more than a dozen of them, faces cold, eyes sharp, weapons in hand. The crowd froze, the air heavy with fear. The leader stepped forward, his voice loud and harsh, declaring that enough was enough. He shouted that the human had broken their order, humiliated them, and challenged the laws of the city. Tonight, the human would answer for it. The old alien trembled, trying to rise, his weak legs barely holding him. He stretched out his hand and tried to place himself between the guards and the human. His voice shook as he begged them to leave the human alone. But the leader shoved him aside easily, sending him stumbling back toward the table. The human caught him before he fell and helped him sit down again. Then he stood, his figure tall, his eyes locked on the guards. The guards ordered him to leave the city at once or be dragged into the streets and beaten until nothing remained of him. They said this tavern would not become a nest for beggars and rebels, and anyone siding with him would suffer the same fate. The human stood silent for a moment, his chest rising slowly, his hands loose at his sides. Then his voice broke through the silence, calm but sharp, carrying across the tavern. He said if kindness was a crime here, then punish him. If paying for the hungry and standing for the weak was rebellion, then let them call him a rebel. But he would never stop paying the price for it. The words hit like a hammer. For a second, the tavern was silent, as if even the walls were listening. The guards' faces darkened with rage. They shouted that enough words had been spoken and drew their weapons. The leader raised his blade and ordered them to take the human down. The human did not move at first. He stood firm as the guards rushed forward, their boots thundering across the floor. At the last moment, he shifted, his arms snapping out to block the first strike. He grabbed one guard's wrist and twisted hard, sending the weapon clattering across the floor. Another guard swung at him. But the human ducked low, driving his fist into the man's stomach with such force that he collapsed gasping for air. The tavern erupted into chaos. The old alien cried out in fear, reaching for the human, but he could not stop what had begun. The guards struck again and again, blades flashing, batons cracking against the tables. The human fought with speed and precision, every movement fierce yet controlled. He slammed one guard against the wall, elbowed another in the jaw, and kicked another's legs out from under him. The sound of bodies hitting the floor echoed through the room, but there were too many, and the human began to take hits. A baton struck his shoulder, a blade cut his arm, but he pushed through the pain, his face hard with determination. The tavern crowd sat frozen at first, their fear holding them down. But as the fight grew wilder, something stirred in them. They saw the human bleeding, yet still standing. They saw him refusing to bow, even as the guards outnumbered him 3-1. The silence broke when a worker in the corner suddenly hurled a cup at one of the guards. It struck the helmet with a loud clang. Another poor alien grabbed a chair and swung it, knocking a guard to the ground. The spark of rebellion spread like fire. Soon, the tavern was alive with shouting. The poor and the weak, those who had once stayed silent, now rose to their feet. They grabbed anything they could, chairs, bottles, tools, and joined the fight. The guards, once confident, found themselves surrounded by a crowd that refused to stay silent anymore. Their armor protected them from some blows, but the sheer force of numbers began to turn the tide. The human fought at the center of it all, his strength the heart of the resistance. He took down another guard with a heavy punch, his eyes blazing with unshaken fire. He shouted for the others to hold their ground, to show the guards they were not afraid anymore. His voice carried like thunder, filling the room with courage. The guards began to falter, their lines breaking under the weight of a tavern full of rebels. The leader, enraged, charged straight at the human. Their blades clashed, the sound sharp and deadly. The leader swung with fury, but the human blocked, countered, and struck back with brutal force. Finally, with one decisive move, he disarmed the leader and sent him crashing to the floor. The tavern roared with triumph as the guards, beaten and humiliated, dragged their wounded out into the night. The room fell into silence, the sound of heavy breathing filling the air. Tables were broken. The floor was covered in spilled food and shattered cups, but something greater had been born in that chaos. The human stood in the middle, blood on his face, sweat on his brow, but his eyes steady and alive. The old alien struggled to his feet and moved toward him, tears streaming down his wrinkled face. He whispered that no one had ever done what the human had done tonight. Around them, the crowd of poor aliens looked at the human not with fear, but with pride. They knew the guards would come back stronger, with more soldiers, with harsher punishment. But they also knew the first battle had been won, and hope was no longer just a dream. The human had dared to stand, and by his courage, he had made them stand too. The rebellion had begun, and there was no turning back. The tavern floor was a battlefield, broken tables and shattered cups scattered across the ground. The smell of sweat, blood, and smoke filled the air. The guards had been forced to retreat, dragging their wounded with them, but the fight had left everyone shaken. The human stood tall at the center, his shirt torn, blood dripping from his arm and face. His chest rose and fell heavily, but his eyes still burned with fire. Around him, the poor aliens who had fought beside him looked at one another in disbelief. They had driven the guards away. They had done the unthinkable. The old alien limped toward him, his frail hands trembling as he reached for the human's arm. Tears streamed down his wrinkled face, and his voice broke as he whispered that dignity had been given back to him tonight. He said he had thought his life was already over, that he would die forgotten and unwanted. But now he had seen something no one believed was possible. The human placed a steady hand on his shoulder, nodding silently, his face calm but filled with unspoken promise. The tavern crowd grew quiet, all eyes on the human. He looked at them, one by one, his gaze steady and unshaken despite the blood on his skin. His voice carried across the room, not loud but strong enough to fill every corner. He told them the guards would return, stronger and more furious. He told them the danger was not over, but that fear could no longer rule them. If they stayed silent again, nothing would change, and cruelty would continue. If they stood together, then the guards would fall, because no law could survive when the people refused to obey. His words struck deeply. The merchants who had once sneered now shifted uneasily, realizing the crowd around them had changed. The poor aliens lifted their heads higher, their eyes no longer dull with hopelessness, but shining with something new. Hope, sharp and alive. Some began to nod, others clenched their fists tightly. The silence in the tavern was no longer fear. It was the silence before a storm. The old alien, his voice trembling but clear, declared that he would no longer bow to the cruelty of the city. He raised his thin arm and swore that if the human stood, then he would stand too, even with his weak body. His words made the crowd murmur with energy. One by one, others rose. A crippled worker leaned on his cane, saying he had nothing left to lose. A young mother held her child close and said she would no longer let her son grow in fear. Another elder lifted his hand, vowing he would not die a beggar. Their voices grew until the whole tavern was alive with oaths of resistance. The human watched them quietly, his lips pressed into a firm line. He had not come to this city to lead anyone, but now the weight of their hope rested on him. He did not refuse it. He accepted it with silence, with a nod, knowing that sometimes leadership was not chosen, It was given by those who needed it most. Outside, the night stretched on, but the city was no longer the same. Word of what had happened spread quickly. Whispers of rebellion carried through the streets, from the markets to the workshops, from beggars' alleys to hidden corners where the poor huddled. They said a human had stood against the guards and won. They said an elder had eaten again, treated with respect, and that the tavern had become a place where cruelty was broken. Hope traveled faster than fear, and by dawn, the story had reached places the guards could not control. The human left the tavern with the old alien walking beside him. The streets were dark, but they were no longer empty. People peered from windows, their eyes wide, their faces filled with curiosity and courage. The human walked calmly, his steps steady, even though pain throbbed in his ribs and cuts burned on his skin. He knew the fight was not finished, that worse battles were ahead. But he also knew something greater had been born tonight, something the guards could not kill with blades or threats. The old alien whispered as they walked that his life had already been given back. He said even if he died tomorrow, he would die with honor, knowing he had not been abandoned. His voice cracked when he told the human that kindness was stronger than fear, and that the guards had no weapon strong enough to kill that. The human looked at him and gave a faint smile, one that carried no pride but quiet resolve. The next morning, the guards returned with more soldiers, their banners waving, their armor shining in the light of the sun. They marched through the streets, shouting threats, demanding the human be delivered to them. But the tavern was no longer silent. The doors opened, and the poor, the weak, and the forgotten stood together. Behind them walked the human, calm and steady, his head high. The guards shouted again, demanding surrender, but no one moved. The silence of the crowd was heavier than steel. For the first time, the guards hesitated. The people they once mocked and crushed with ease now stood shoulder to shoulder, no longer afraid. The human's presence was like a shield, his defiance a fire that burned in all of them. The guards realized they were no longer fighting one man. They were fighting a city that had awakened. The old alien stepped forward, his frail body shaking, but his voice rang out clearly across the square. He declared that they would no longer kneel, that their dignity was not for sale, and that their lives were worth more than fear. His voice, thin and cracked, carried more power than the guards' shouts. The crowd erupted, voices rising together, shouting their defiance, their anger, their hope. The square shook with their cries. The guards tightened their grip on their weapons, but their eyes flickered with doubt. They had always ruled through silence and fear, but tonight both had been broken. The human stood in the middle, steady, silent, but his very presence was louder than any roar. His courage had sparked rebellion, and rebellion was alive now, carried in every voice, every trembling hand, every defiant stare. The old alien looked up at him with tears in his eyes and whispered words only he could hear. "You gave me dignity again, and you gave it to all of us." From that day forward, no poor alien was ever thrown out of the tavern again. And the story of the human who stood for the weak spread far beyond the city, a tale that grew into legend, proof that sometimes all it took was one act of courage to change the world.